Coming up on Locked On Dodgers, we'll discuss some listener feedback about which Dodgers pitchers might be negatively impacted by banning the shift. We'll also talk about Pat Hoberg's perfect game in the World Series, and we'll talk about the fact that Nolan Arenado will not be coming to the Dodgers. So let's get Locked On Dodgers.
You are Locked On Dodgers, your daily Los Angeles Dodgers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Dodger fans. This is Locked On Dodgers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Dodgers your first listen every day. Remember, this show is free and available on all podcast platforms and on YouTube simply by searching for Locked On Dodgers. Or even better, go ahead and subscribe wherever you're watching or listening right now, and then you will never miss a day because you know we're not going to. If this is your first time watching or listening, my name is Jeff Snider. My normal co-host is Vince Samperio, although it's just me today. Vince and I are both lifelong Dodger fans just like you are. We've also both spent time covering the Dodgers in the press box and the locker room. So we're not quite insiders, but we bring you the smart fans perspective on our boys in blue every weekday morning. And you might think I'm being like Carol Burnett, you know, how she used to twitch her nose as a signal out to somebody on her show. Nope, I just had an itchy nose, so I have now scratched it 3 times so far. Those of you on podcasts, that's kind of stuff you're missing by not watching on YouTube, but we appreciate having you on podcast anyway. And I think it's safe to just assume every 30 seconds or so, I'm going to be scratching my nose because it itches tonight. Anyway, what's up? I'm Jeff, like I said, lots to talk about with the Dodgers. It's a fun time of the year in that there's no actual news happening for the Dodgers, which means sometimes we get to talk about just general baseball stuff. So our second and third segments today, one will be about the umpiring in the World Series, and the other one will be about a guy who has never played for the Dodgers, continuing to not play for the Dodgers, but it's all kind of tangentially related to the Dodgers and definitely related to baseball. And there's one thing I know about Dodger fans is that they're also baseball fans. So that's what we're doing. But first, we're going to jump into some listener feedback about my episode last week talking about Tyler Anderson and how I hope the Dodgers bring Tyler Anderson back. I said I hope they make him the qualifying offer, and they end up agreeing on a 2 or 3 year contract at maybe lesser average annual value. And a listener named Jersey Shore Score on Twitter, Twitter handle Jersey Shore Score, except without the O in score. He or she said Tyler Anderson, as a pitch to contact pitcher, figures to be negatively impacted by the ban on shifts. I would prefer him on a 1 year qualifying offer or a 2 year deal max. And it logically makes sense that a pitcher who doesn't strike out many guys would be more susceptible to the whims of the batted ball once the shift is banned. But what I realized was some people track these things, and I wonder what we can find out. And luckily, I happen to know one of those people. His name is Mark Simon. He's a former guest on this podcast. One of the smartest people I know. He's a friend of mine. He works for Sports Info Solutions, and I happen to know that Sports Info Solutions tracks these hits and basically which hitters and pitchers will be most impacted, or I should say, would have been most impacted if they had banned the shift this year. We have no way of knowing what's going to happen in the future. We don't know if hitters will change their approach, all that thing. One thing we learned last month when they were talking about banning the shift is that Corey Seager would have had the biggest impact of all hitters. I think it was like something like 28 hits he lost to the shift that would have been hits otherwise. And so, you can kind of say that he would likely have 28 more hits next year. It's not perfect because even without the shift, you can still play their percentages a little bit. You can say, okay, well, he hits it right here. So who knows what the actual effects will be. Corey Seager might change his approach some. It could even be more because he might pull the ball even more. Guys who didn't look like they might have a huge shift impact could have a big one because they now, maybe they had been trying to go the opposite way and now they can pull the ball more, which means hitting with more power or whatever. A lot of unforeseen consequences, but based on what we do know, I asked Mark Simon if that sounded accurate, that Tyler Anderson specifically would be susceptible to being impacted by the ban on the shifts. And Mark dug into it for me, which I really, really appreciate it. He's on Twitter at Mark A. Simon Says. Mark, the letter A, Simon Says. And like I said, he works at Sports Info Solutions, very smart guy. And I sent him that tweet from Jersey Shore Score. And I just said, do you have any idea if this is accurate? It makes sense logically that the fewer batters you strike out, the higher your chance of being adversely affected by the shift ban. But do you have any idea if it's true for Tyler Anderson specifically? Man, that's a lot easier to type than to say. But Mark got back to me and he said, it's actually a much bigger deal for Tony Gonsolin. He said, we have outs lost and gained to the shift stat, and Gonsolin ranked second in MLB with 18 outs gained. Jameson Taillon had 19. That was the only one with more. So Gonsolin had the second most outs gained because of the shift. Tyler Anderson was only at 5. So this season in 2022, he only gained 5 outs because of the shift, which put another way, he would lose those 5 outs next year. 5 outs is very, very small. It's not nothing, but it's a very small amount. He said, here's the same stat put another way. The Dodgers turned 81.6% of Gonsolin's grounders and bunts into outs, the 6th highest rate in MLB, and 84.6 when using a full shift. So Tony Gonsolin might be the guy we should be concerned about more. And if you look at their underlying stats, you can kind of see it. I went to Baseball Savant and looked at kind of their rankings. And one thing that really jumped out at me is the average exit velocity. Tony Gonsolin's average exit velocity. Man, words are hard for me tonight. I'm sorry. I'm going to do my best to get through this podcast. Tony Gonsolin's average exit velocity is in the 35th percentile, which means 65% of pitchers allow a lower average exit velocity than Gonsolin does. And that's not great. Everything else, he's pretty solid. He's at least in the red. You know, these little ranking bars, if you haven't seen, if you just go to Baseball Savant, if you even Google Savant Tony Gonsolin, the top option will be his Baseball Savant page, and you can see their percentile rankings for a lot of different things. Hard hit percentage, he's in the 72nd percentile, pretty good. xERA divided by xWOBA, 80 percentile, which, you know, all expected numbers based on the quality of contact. These are some of the expected numbers. His barrel percentage is solid 77th percentile. You know, but that average exit velocity is the one that really jumps out if you compare it to Tyler Anderson, average exit velocity, 98th percentile. That is very, very good. Only a couple pitchers in baseball allow a lower average exit velocity than Tyler Anderson in 2022. Hard hit percentage, 98th percentile. Again, only a couple pitchers allowed fewer hard hit balls than Tyler Anderson. And what that says to me is if you're not allowing the ball to be hit hard, your chances of getting outs is much better. And that sounds obvious, and it kind of is. And so it doesn't matter as much that these guys are, you know, putting the ball in play. They can, you're not striking out guys, whatever. You are not susceptible to those whims if not hitting the ball hard, because your fielders can get to the ball if it's not hit hard. And so for me, if you look at Tyler Anderson's previous years, if I go to 2021, average exit velocity was only 84th percentile, still solid, but not great. 2020, 77th percentile. He's kind of gotten better most, you know, as the years have gone on. And 2022 was his best year. And what we know about 2022 was that Tyler Anderson changed his changeup, and his changeup was one of the best pitches in baseball. And so for me, I'm less concerned about Tyler Anderson with the banning of the shift because he doesn't allow people to hit the ball hard. And I think that's really, really important. And according to Mark, the numbers back that up. And so I don't know if we should be worried about Gonsolin. I think it's something to think about. And I may have Mark see if he has any other information he can dig into that, you know, or give it some thought at least, because I'm not sure what I think that means for Gonsolin next year, but something to think about. But I'm not worried about it for Tyler Anderson. And for purposes of this discussion, I think that's enough. So I'm going to come back in a minute. I'm going to talk about Pat Hoberg's perfect game umpiring in the World Series on Saturday. So thank you for making Locked On Dodgers your first listen every weekday morning, and please keep it Locked On Dodgers. BetOnline.net is your number one source for betting football and the start of the new basketball season. Find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth analysis on every game. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sports wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events, including Major League Baseball, MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, I am back, and I want to thank you again for making Locked On Dodgers your first listen every weekday morning. It really does mean a lot to us, and we'd love to hear your comments, your feedback. If you're watching on YouTube, love to see your comments in the comment section here. If you're listening on the podcast, we'd love to hear your thoughts on social media. I'll be sure to give you all of our contact info at the end of the episode, like I always do. But let's jump right into my next topic of conversation, which is on Saturday night, umpire Pat Hoberg had a perfect game. There were 129 pitches that were not swung at. Excuse me, I had to take a drink of water. 129 pitches that weren't swung at in the game. And Pat Hoberg correctly called 129 of them. Every single pitch that wasn't swung at that was in the strike zone, Pat Hoberg called it a strike. Every pitch that wasn't swung at that was out of the strike zone, Pat Hoberg called it a ball. And that is a big deal. It is actually the first perfect game since ump scorecards started tracking these things 6 or 8 years ago. Not just first in the World Series, first ever. Now, it's not surprising that it was Hoberg who did, because Pat Hoberg is a very good umpire. He is, depending on how you look at, either the first or second best umpire in baseball in 2022. He is very good at calling balls and strikes. But like I said, this is the first perfect game, which means even Pat Hoberg, who's very good at it, his average was like 95.6% or something this year, which is very good for an umpire. But the average in Major League Baseball was about 94%. And so for me, this perfect game by Pat Hoberg, it almost made me want robot umps even more, which I didn't know was possible, because I really like the idea of robot umps. And for one simple reason, as excited as people were on Sunday morning to see ump scorecards and realize we had a perfect game in the World Series. I mean, this thing, ump scorecards tweet about this, currently has 6,469 retweets and 42,634 likes. That is a lot. It is people are very excited about Pat Hoberg's perfect game. Imagine if we could have that every game. Do you see what I'm getting at? The technology exists for us to have that right, have a perfect game every game, and yet we're not doing it. It's like, okay, imagine you take your kid to preschool. You drop off your 3-year-old daughter at preschool, and they say, hey, we have a juggler coming in. He juggles chainsaws, and 94% of the time, he doesn't mess up. Would you leave your daughter at preschool? I understand Major League umpiring is not quite as high stakes as chainsaw juggling in front of 3-year-olds. But I don't even know how to put this. When you put it on an extreme level of something super important like that, you understand how ridiculous it is to settle for 94% when 100% is possible. I was down in St. George, Utah this weekend. My son had a baseball tournament. I was down there with him, had a lot of fun. I love being in St. George, especially this time of year. Where I live, it's in the 30s and 40s, and I drive 3 hours south, and it's in the 70s and beautiful, and hanging out in the pool when we're not playing baseball. Wonderful weekend. It was a busy weekend in St. George because there was an Ironman triathlon going on. It actually took me an extra 10 minutes to get to our first games on Friday, because the route that Google Maps told me to drive from our rented condo to the baseball field was also the route for the Ironman biking route. And so we had to go around. Unfortunately, not all cars did go around. I heard there was one accident where a car hit 2 bikers, and the driver has been arrested, thank goodness, and both bikers survived. Anyway, that's not what I'm talking about here. But Ironman is a cool event. You start by swimming 2.4 miles, and then you run a marathon, 26.2 miles, and then you hop on a bike and you bike 140.6 miles. That is actually no, the marathon's last. Sorry, you swim and then you ride the bike, and then you do the run. A full marathon is crazy. Like the rules say you have to finish in like 17 hours. Can you imagine doing anything for 17 hours, let alone rigorous exercise? Ironman triathletes are a different breed. I know a lot of them personally. My cousins are actually in the Guinness Book of World Records for most members of one family completing an Ironman triathlon on the same day. My uncle and all 5 of his children completed the triathlon, the Ironman, on November 3rd, 2012. I remember the date because it was my daughter's 8th birthday, not because I love my cousins that much, although I do love my cousins and I'm proud of them. And it was actually, so it was 6 of them in the Guinness Book of World Records. There was actually 8 of them who did it because 2 of them, their spouses did too. My cousin Nathan's wife and my cousin Holly's husband also did the triathlon. So 8 members of the family did it, but the record in the Guinness Book of World Records is for members of the same birth family. So it's just my uncle and his 5 kids. Anyway, I love the triathlon. I think it's cool. Can you imagine if right now, as we are a day or two after this huge Ironman triathlon in St. George, if people were celebrating the fact that every single competitor swam the whole 2.4 miles, ran the whole 26.2 miles, and biked the whole 140.6 miles. Like everybody did the whole thing. Like, and you're saying, your average triathlon, your average Ironman, only 94% of people actually follow the rules and do the whole thing. But this time, every single one did. We'd be like, y'all need to get better enforcement of your rules if 6% of people at every race don't even follow the rules. And for me, that's what it's like with having umpires who aren't getting the balls and strikes right. It's rules enforcement. Umpires aren't part of the game. Umpires are there to enforce the rules that are in the rule book. One of the rules in the rule book says if the batter doesn't swing and the ball's in the strike zone, it's a strike. If the batter doesn't swing and the ball's out of the strike zone, it's a ball. Those are rules in the rule book. Umpires should be enforcing the rules perfectly. And if umpires are incapable of enforcing the rules perfectly, and you have technology that is capable, then the technology should be in charge of that rules enforcement. That's what it boils down to. So while I applaud and salute Pat Hoberg for his perfect game, all it does is make me want even more for every single World Series game and every single Major League Baseball game to be decided by the players on the field and not by the umpire. And when you're missing calls, there's always a chance that it's going to be decided. And I talked about this just a week or two ago about how the umpiring in the NLDS affected the Dodgers. It's frustrating. I don't like missed calls. And I fear that we are going to see a huge contrast in tonight's game 3 because tonight's umpire is Dan Iasonia. He's the crew chief. The crew chief should be the best umpire on the staff, on the crew. He's not. Dan Iasonia, I mentioned Pat Hoberg is either first or second best. Out of 89 umpires this year, Pat Hoberg had the second highest accuracy rating out of the 89 umpires who called at least 10 games behind the plate this year. Dan Iasonia, where does he rank out of 89 umpires? 76th. He's 76 out of 89, and he is umpiring game 3 of the World Series. The first game after a perfect game by Pat Hoberg. Guess what? Dan Iasonia is going to throw up a 91 or 92% tonight. And we're going to be like, holy crap, why are we settling for this when we know perfection is possible? Problem is perfection on a regular basis is not possible by humans. The reason what Pat Hoberg did is notable is because it's almost impossible to do. It's not impossible for computers. Computers should be calling balls and strikes. That's what it boils down to. And Dan Iasonia is going to remind us of that tonight. You come back tomorrow because I told you, Dan Iasonia, we won't know by tomorrow's episode. We won't know the score because I have to record this. We have to record this podcast on Monday night before we won't get the score on Iasonia until Tuesday morning. But I promise you, just watching game 3, you're going to be like, oh, he missed that one. Oh, he missed that one. There's going to be a handful of calls he misses because Dan Iasonia, unlike Pat Hoberg, is not a very good umpire. And even Pat Hoberg, who's a very good umpire, who just had a perfect game in the World Series, isn't good enough to be worth it because 100% is possible and it should be our expectation when we're talking about rules enforcement. That's all I have to say about that. I'm going to come back in a minute. I'm going to talk about Nolan Arenado, who has never been a Dodger, but for a little brief time, I held out a little bit of hope that he might be a Dodger at some point. And that's happened to him a few times during his career. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the news about him over the weekend, how it affects the Dodgers, and all of that. So thank you again for making Locked On Dodgers your first listen every weekday morning. And please keep it Locked On Dodgers. All right, I am back. I want to thank you one last time for making Locked On Dodgers your first listen. It does mean a lot to us. Again, please comment in the comment section on YouTube if you're watching there. Comment on social media if you're listening on the podcast. You can comment on social media if you're watching on YouTube too, if that's what you want to do. All sorts of options for you. We'd love to hear your feedback. And like you saw, it was a Twitter comment about last week's episode that got us all that information about Tyler Anderson and Tony Gonsolin in this first segment of today's episode. So it really does help us out, and I hope it helps you guys enjoy the podcast a little bit more when you give us feedback. So I want to talk about Nolan Arenado. Arenado has never been a Dodger. He's played the first, 6-8 years of his career with the Rockies, 8 years with the Rockies, and then they traded him to the Cardinals, and he has now been there for 2 years. And he has 5 years left on his contract, and he had a potential opt-out for his contract. And he has 5 years left, and he's owed $144 million over these 5 years, which comes out to just under $28.8 million a year, I believe. It's a lot of money. And Arenado is going into his age 32 season. He's going to turn 32 April 16th, I think, just after opening day next year. And so this contract goes through his age 36 season. Arenado still appears to be as good as ever. He had maybe his best offensive season. He had his best offensive season this year, I think. He had a very good defensive season, among his best, and he had his best overall season. He was very, very good. He's going to finish top 5 in the MVP voting, probably even top 3. We'll see what the voting does, but very good season. And on the open market, I think he could have gotten, I don't know if he could have topped 5 years and 144 million, because problem is he is going into his age 32 season. There is a lot of uncertainty. A guy like, he doesn't have speed. A lot of his value, he's a very good hitter and he plays very good defense. And you worry that those things might go away. And even just last year, he wasn't a very good hitter. He was a solid hitter, but not a great hitter. And his defense last year was not as good as it's been in the past. By last year, I mean 2021. So 2022 was a bounce back year for him. And so I think some teams might have been a little bit gun shy about him if he had chosen to opt out and go back onto the open market. I believe that the only reason Arenado would have opted out is if he thought he could sign with the Dodgers. Arenado is from Southern California. He's from Lake Forest. He grew up going to Dodger games sometimes. There was always a thought. The Dodgers were very interested in getting Arenado when the Rockies were looking to trade him. The Rockies refused to even consider trading him to the Dodgers, so they ended up giving him away to the Cardinals, which was frustrating for everybody. But I believe that if Arenado had opted out, I would have given the Dodgers 85% chance of signing him if he had opted out, because I think he would have opted out with the Dodgers in mind. And I think the reason he chose to opt in is because he didn't believe the Dodgers would be willing to come close to that 5 years, $144 million that he has left. If he could have guaranteed the Dodgers would give him that, I think he would have opted out. I think all things being equal, he would have preferred to get that money from the Dodgers. But he couldn't guarantee that. He's not allowed to talk about that. You can't talk to other teams when you're under contract with one team. He's also a Scott Boras client, which sometimes impacts negotiation with the Dodgers. All in all, I don't think it was ever very likely. But there was a report that came out over the weekend that Arenado was going to opt out of his contract. This report came from an unverified source, a Twitter account that claims to be the burner account for an MLB executive. MLB executive has a very broad definition that could mean, a lot of different people could call themselves MLB executives, and a good percentage of them have no idea what they're talking about when it comes to player movement and stuff like that. And then the other thing is, all we know is that's what the person claims to be. Chances are he's a nobody. It's a nobody. And so anyway, we had that brief glimmer of hope. Ooh, Arenado might opt out, and if he does, I think he'd want to come to the Dodgers. And then that changes the Justin Turner discussion, changes everything, changes a lot of things. But we found out on Sunday, Arenado is opting into his last 5 years with the Cardinals, which essentially means Arenado is never going to play for the Dodgers unless it's a Albert Pujols kind of thing at the end of his career, a David Freese thing. Arenado, in his peak as a great player, is never going to be a Dodger, which is a little bit of a bummer. I would have liked to see Arenado as a Dodger. I really like Arenado as a player, and I think he could have done well at Dodger Stadium. The Dodgers could have done good for him. Would have been a lot of fun, and it was fun to dream about briefly, but it's not going to happen. And it's a bummer. I would have liked to have Nolan Arenado, but I understand it's hard to walk away from 5 years and $144 million, even though Arenado so far in his career has made $166 million. So he's not going hungry. Even if he had walked away from that and nobody signs him, chances are, your worst case scenario, he loses 20 or 30 million bucks, which sounds like a lot of money to you and me, but doesn't actually mean that much to somebody with $250,000 otherwise. But he's not going to walk away from that unless he was sure he had a better deal, or a deal that he liked more anyway. And that wasn't a guarantee, so it's not going to happen. But it was fun to talk about, and it means that we won't have Arenado rumors to talk about this offseason. So I had to get that in while I could, while it was still newsworthy. And that's going to do it for me for today. I really do appreciate you guys checking out Locked On Dodgers every weekday morning. It means a lot to me. It means a lot to Vince. We enjoy talking Dodgers with you guys. It's always fun. We'd love to hear your feedback, as I mentioned. So thanks for making us your first listen. And now for your second listen, check out the Locked On Sports Today podcast, the biggest stories of the day, plus instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day. Available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get podcasts. If you're not watching or listening every day, we'd love if you had 1 or 2 days a month to your rotation. If you have friends and family who love the Dodgers like you do, please tell them about the show. They might like it. You can follow us. Oh, let me get these little graphics up while I'm saying this. You can follow us on Instagram and on Twitter at Locked On Dodgers. Vince is on Twitter at Vince Samperio. I am on Twitter at Snidog, and the DMs are open in all of those places. Our email address is lockedondodgers@gmail.com, and our phone number for voicemails or text messages is 323-863-LOCK-5625. We are here every weekday morning. We hope you'll be here with us. When you get in your car or sit on your couch, tell your smart device to play podcast Locked On Dodgers. And remember, you don't have to agree. You just have to listen. We'll talk to you tomorrow.